Thank you to Keegan, thank you to ENCATE for inviting me to talk. I'm going to talk to you a bit about anti-Semitism and gender-based abuse. There is a long history of anti-Jewish racism with a gendered or sexist element to it. Hundreds of years, appeared in early Christian texts. But I'm actually just going to spend a second talking about men first. So in these texts, men were portrayed as sexual deviants, as predatory, as promiscuous, as corrupt. Men were supposedly encouraging promiscuity or abortion. For the Nazis, the propaganda warned of a kind of a male sexual law, but also men as rapists seeking to usurp kind of the Aryan race, the whites, seeking to overtake an inherent enemy. And this, for the Nazis, enhanced their kind of vision of a white male who was a defender of women and you know, having mastery over women. But the men, as well as being portrayed, and you so often see this with anti-Semitism, you see it kind of, it works both ways, as well as the men being portrayed as these kind of powerful secret cabal trying to influence women. Jewish men were also portrayed as weak, effeminate, dehumanized through their caricatures of grotesque kind of personal attributes. And that was used to justify violence against men. And that ultimately is where this nice Jewish boy stereotype comes from, right? A lack of stereotypically male characteristics. So you see already how central kind of anti-Semitism is in these white supremacist gendered spaces, just by looking at what was written about Jewish men over time. And it's interesting to see that overlap. But of course, so much of the focus when we're talking about gendered abuse and anti-Semitism is of Jewish women. Now, Jewish women experience, of course, different types of abuse. So straight anti-Semitic abuse, unrelated to their gender. And we know that women across Europe, and indeed certainly here in the UK, do experience that anti-Semitic abuse. Sexist abuse, unrelated to the Jewish heritage or affiliation. And then this intersecting abuse where you face an assault on both of your identities at once, and indeed sometimes other identities, because you know, Jewish women are not just necessarily Jews and women, but you know, perhaps have other identities that intersect with their Judaism or their sects too. Now, this also goes back hundreds of years, the Middle Ages. There are medieval Christian anti-Semitic tropes and images. Jewish women were portrayed as castrating, including castrating Jesus, as sexually deviant, like with men, as unfaithful, and lots of images of kind of sexualized Jewish women. In fact, I don't have time to get into it, there's a whole other talk I could give about Jewish women and witches, right? There was a whole thing going back to kind of, I think, the 10th century about Jewish witches and the suggestion that Jews and pagans were in together trying to cause mischief. You know, it's where the idea of the Black Sabbath came from, Jewish women and demons. So there's a whole history that paints women as trying to either trick people or to take away their rights, as I say, to castrate them or somehow lure them. Now, it moved from this kind of, and I should say this picture here is an example from the 19th century. This is comparing the noses of Jewish women. Now, this abuse moved from a kind of theological intersection abuse to modern times, less religious, but equally kind of demonizing effort. So in Nazi propaganda, it was used to dehumanize, to inspire disgust of Jewish women. Jewish women were compared to Aryan women who supposedly were beautiful and elegant, were, you know, the hardworking mum, the wife loyal to the country, and Jewish women were old, grotesque, dirty, unhygienic. The young Jewish women were oversexed, promiscuous, disease carriers. So it didn't matter where you sat on that age scale. The frame was of one of disgust, distrust, or women seeking to somehow impact German society as the Nazis had it. Now, there is another frame, which I'll come back to, which is of the man-hating feminist. I'll come back to that. But what you can see is this anti-Semitic misogyny is so fundamental to tropes and narratives that have persisted over hundreds of years. They're updated by the Nazis, and then they're further updated. These things, they're not always so straightforward and blatant. So, for example, we have the Jewish princess, the idea of the Jewish princess, right? As before, you have the nice Jewish boy, here you have the nice Jewish princess. And the kind of the sexism and the trope get merged. So Jewish women, as the Jewish princess, become materialistic, money-grabbing, manipulative, right? And these tropes are normalized through humor. And that's how they're brought into the mainstream. Now, that humor can be used for very good effect, right? We know that humor can be used to deconstruct or challenge racism, but it can also be used, certainly it is used on the far right. You will see it with the Pepe the Frog memes and other things like that, where they try and use humorous memes to get people into a discourse of hatred. But and that's used strategically in that way. But here it seems kind of light touch, right? It's, you know, Goldie Hawn in Private Benjamin, it's Ben Stiller and Meet the Parents. You see those themes are kind of a particular way of Jewish being that are made accessible for people. And that, though they're funny, and I'm not trying to, like, you know, say that you can't have fun in this stuff, but though they're funny, they begin a pathway to a particular way of thinking. And that blurring and the mischief can become radicalization. You can kind of normalize and trivialize violence, and it's a way for ideas to spread without the harm being so obvious. So this is what I think has happened. Now, I love doing this with any people that I'm training about anti-Semitism. I think it's helpful to understand. Now, what happened was the CST in the UK, a charity which monitors hate crime, worked with the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, which is an organization that seeks to capture data about the Jewish community. And they asked the British public, as a cross-section, 4,500 people, about that number. And this was done about 5 years ago. They're redoing it at the moment. They asked them a number of questions. First, they asked them how favorable they felt towards Jews. And broadly speaking, most people felt favorably towards Jews, the same favorability they felt towards the Hindu community or the Sikh community in the UK. People were less favorable about Muslims, worryingly. But, you know, generally they were pretty favorable about Jews. They then took the same group of people and put a number of statements to them that you can see on the screen. Now, some of these statements were placebos, so they were kind of regular questions, like a British Jew is just as British as any other British person. But some of them were anti-Semitic. Jews think they're better than other people. Jews exploit Holocaust victimhood for their own purposes. Now, generally speaking, okay, people didn't agree with the anti-Semitic statements, which is good, but obviously some did, right? A small percentage, like 2%, thought the Holocaust is a myth, right? Now, what they did is they looked at all of these questions and they looked at how many of them an individual person had agreed with. And what they found was that whereas the majority of the population didn't agree with the anti-Semitic statements, 70% didn't agree, at least 30% agreed with one of the statements, right? Now, that means not all that 30% are anti-Semites, but they hold an anti-Semitic attitude, or they've heard something at school and they've repeated it, you know, they need some education. And probably 2, 3, 4%, 4% of the, let's say, of the British population might be considered anti-Semites because they agreed with a number of the anti-Semitic statements. So the chances of encountering anti-Semitism for a British Jew are about 1 in 3, right? Chances of encountering an anti-Semite are much smaller. Now, we ran a conference on anti-Semitism and misogyny, and Dr. John Boyd from the Institute for Jewish Policy Research came, and he noted that YouGov, which is a British polling organisation, had data which indicated that British misogynists made up 2 to 3% of the population, whereas misogynist ideas were held by 30% of the population, right? An unbelievable overlap. So the point being that Jewish women in this case are far more likely to encounter gendered anti-Semitism or misogynist anti-Semitic ideas and have that dual experience and harm than they are to experience, to meet anti-Semitic misogynists per se. But the chances of them encountering those ideas, and as I say, those ideas can spread quite easily and can start with the kind of the humor and what have you, right? The chances of encountering those ideas is so high. And of course, ideas, why am I saying all this? Ideas spread and they radicalize. And now where you hold those ideas, it's no longer that you say them in a bar or a pub and they just disappear. It tends to be you might put them online and people find them online and they look at them and they share them. And then I think the worrying future for this percentage is that it will go up because these ideas are being shared and we don't have the means to effectively challenge them, and we don't have enough online regulation in place to effectively combat them. And things that start with an idea, something that you see, can of course lead to those radicalized pathways whereby, and we know this in the case of the incel community, an individual might read things online, the next day he might shout at a woman in a bar, the next day he might throw his drink over her, and before you know it, you'll get down that pathway of radicalization to real world harms, particularly terrorism or murder. So we have a great deal of work to do. And part of what we've been doing, so I should have said at the beginning, Danny, I mean, you did introduce me, but I run the Antisemitism Policy Trust. It's a charity, and we work to educate particularly decision makers about anti-Semitism. And a few years back, we were of the view, this is 2018, that there was a particular issue around anti-Semitism and misogyny, abuse of Jewish women. And this was at the height of the crisis in the Labour Party here in the UK over anti-Semitism. And so many of the people that were speaking out online against the anti-Semitism were women, and the ways in which they were being attacked drew on the fact that they were women. So it was rape threat, anti-Semitic rape threats, or death threats, and what have you. And some of those people are in this picture. Ruth Smeeth, who's is now a member of the House of Lords, was a member of the House of Commons, Luciana Berger, two very high-profile, and Louise Ellman here, high-profile Jewish parliamentarians who had spoken out. So we put together a conference called the SARA Conference. We had the support of the government in the UK, the all-party parliamentary group against anti-Semitism, and ourselves. Brought together experts, NGOs, faith groups, campaigners, and lots of other people who wanted to learn from one another and work out what could be done. And as part of that process, we sought to advance the learning about this issue and get more data, because there's actually very little real research out there, from what I've seen at least, in this area. Now it's starting to improve, but there was at the time certainly very little. So what we particularly wanted to do was to understand big data. And I don't know, this is just an aside, but for anyone who's interested, my eye into this was through a book by an American data scientist called Seth Stephens-Davidovich. Read his book, and it gives an amazing insight into how big data works. For example, President Obama gave 2 speeches on Islamophobia. The first one was generic, and Islamophobic search terms increased after his speech. The second one was about Muslim sporting heroes and military heroes, and searches for Muslim sporting and military heroes went up after his speech. So it just gives you an insight into how you can nudge people to certain kind of behaviors through, or certainly understand behaviors and then potentially nudge them through big data capture. So we worked with Seth Stephens-Davidovich to try and understand something about anti-Semitism and misogyny on different platforms. And so we looked at the classic tropes which continue online, these anti-Semitic misogynist tropes, and some of them are updated and they kind of are used in this 21st century digital space. So since it was set up, this website Stormfront, which some of you might know, is a far-right chat board, right? And it's been online and offline But up until 2018, which is the point where we recorded the data, there had been more than 9,000 threads on Stormfront related to feminism, right? Now, 60% of those threads on feminism also mention Jews. For context, of contrast, in any post, any thread on Stormfront, right, 39% of them mention Jews. So there was a higher percentage of those that mention Jews in the discussion of feminism than on all threads across Stormfront. So there was a particular thing going on. It was a focus for people. And I should say 33% of any on all subjects across that message board mentioned what they used blacks, right? So it gives you some contrast. So 33 of all of the threads mentioned blacks, 39 mentioned Jews, and 60% relating to feminism mentioned Jews. Now, the thinking in those posts is that Jews were responsible for or leading the feminist movement. And in the minds of these far-right users of the website, they were victims of this feminist movement. So it was a kind of a threat to what they perceived of as Western values, including the idea that women should be subservient or submissive. And the advancements in equality were a threat to their world, and the primary role of the woman as mother, caregiver, wife. But they were blaming Jewish people for this advancement in feminism. Now, we did some other work at this conference with a group called Media Matters, an American NGO, to look further at this intersection of misogyny and anti-Semitism, particularly about how people are drawn in. And this links to the online world and conspiracism, which I think is where most of the anti-Semitism action is these days. And what they found was that, and we come back to this in some other research we did, that there was a symbiosis of different things going on. So some people started in conspiratorial spaces, right? They would look at, and also race-based grievance, these cross over, the white genocide. So a suggestion there's a great replacement. Jews are seeking through immigration to usurp white supremacy, white nationalism. Cultural Marxism, there's a Jewish plot to subvert the cultural mores and the standards of, of the West, the white West. And then also different spaces, people who are playing games and then get drawn into far-right game-playing spaces and then down a rabbit hole. But also as part of this, the manosphere, the incel communities that are in those spaces, which overlap, of course, with conspiracy theory, they get drawn down into these spaces. And essentially, you can come from any one of these different groupings and be drawn down into anti-Semitic misogyny because of the plots of Jews as all powerful, Jews as behind whether it be feminism or as I say, trying to subvert these cultural mores. A shady cabal at the center of it all. Particularly where people are drawn in from resentment of women, social isolation, sexual frustration, they will blame minoritized women, particularly Jewish women, for their unhappiness. And that leads them to connect with all these other people and start those online communities. And that's how those ideas can be spread. Or you can have some men in these simply race-based grievance spaces who then, as part of the discourse online with the gender-based grievances, end up being drawn into or indoctrinated to adopt misogynist views. So this is happening. We know this is happening online, and there are some examples of it happening. So the tragic example in 噚Norway, 2011, 77 people killed. The terrorist was a proponent of cultural Marxism, which I talked about, white genocide, he's an anti-feminist and an anti-Semite, and he justified his killing. So in his manifesto, he writes of his disappointment that, in his words, the world is becoming increasingly feminized, society is turning into a matriarchy, and feminism will end European society as we know it. And then also on Jews, He said, there's no Jewish problem in Western Europe, with the exception of the UK and France, as we only have 1 million in Western Europe, whereas 800,000 out of these million live in France and the UK. The US, on the other hand, with more than 6 million Jews, 600% more than Europe, actually has a considerable Jewish problem. So you've got this adjacent misogyny and anti-Semitism in a far-right space, in his manifesto, and it's part of the ideology that ends up with him killing a number of people. Now, you also have other examples. That was obviously, he was a far-right anti-Semite. This is another example. Bronze Age Pervert is a pseudonymous account, social media personality, who's sought to kind of influence understandings of masculinity on the far right and got noticed by the more mainstream. At one point, had 75,000 followers on Twitter, was banned in 2021. And kind of the account, it fetishizes like hyper-masculinity. So it's erotic pictures of men, it's about white achievement, about a lost past. He wanted a kind of a rebirth or a revival in the face of this perceived decline. I self-published this book. It was number 3 on Amazon's best-selling ancient Greek history list. And it's a hierarchical worldview, which I think touches on anti-Semitism. So it included lines like, the defeated male that is turned into a peon and a neutered beast for women and hidden masters is a terrible thing to see. And legal freedom is a practical magic trick by hidden masters, right? So a lot of this kind of conspiratorial language. Now, the UK charity Hope Not Hate found the original Twitter account for this Bronze Age Pervert, which had been deleted in 2017. And that included a tweet that said, if you copulate with the seductive Jewess, choose štiàRkiរិ, reform Ashkenazi, uses a derogatory word of filthy. Now, that gives you a sense of, again, an individual in the far right space, toxic masculinity, and then the link into anti-Semitism. Now, the work that we did with Media Matters, we also looked at the far-right alternative platform 4chan. Now, for those that don't know it, it's kind of these forums. I mean, lots of these far-right forums act like the platforms that you know, Twitter or YouTube or what have you, but they're just horrible spaces. So BitChute or 4chan or 8chan or any of these. So on 4chan, again, this is working back to our conference, so 2018, what they found was posts on 4chan that were anti-Semitic had grown from around the 600,000 mark in 2015 to 1.7 million in 2018. Misogynist posts on 4chan had risen to 2017, 838,000, up from about 500,000. There was a drop-off because a number of them were related to Hillary Clinton when she stood for president. But there was a growing trend on misogynistic posts on 4chan. And then they looked at the overlap between the two, and they found out at its high point in 2017, there'd been a 180% increase in posts that included both anti-Semitic and misogynistic comments. So you see that this isn't kind of, we're starting to sense a picture here. It's Stormfront, it's 4chan, it leaks into the mainstream, this idea of anti-Semitism and misogyny, of the manosphere and race-based grievance overlapping and having that intersectional impact is certainly there. And of course, like, you know, I'm talking about fringe platform at the moment, but here in the UK, we had an organisation that found 714 anti-Semitic posts on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. They've been viewed 7.3 million collective times, and the platforms have failed to act in 84% of the cases. So, you know, this stuff isn't just on the fringe platforms, as I'm sure people on this call well know. The stuff that starts in these platforms tends to leak over. And one of the things that we picked up particularly is that it's women in public life who really trigger these far right and nasty elements. So here, for example, you've got a Jewish woman who'd written, a Jewish journalist, excuse me, who'd written an article, and in the far right spaces, they'd taken the happy merchant caricature. If you've seen this, is kind of very common in far right spaces, of a hand-wringing, hook-nosed, grotesque caricature of a Jew and put it on here to denote that the lady, the journalist who'd written this, is a Jew, right? But they've done the happy merchant in female form. It's usually in male form. Now, we know from the work that we did with Seth that I've been talking about, that the two British Jewish MPs, members of parliament, with the most mentions on Stormfront were Margaret Hodge and Luciana Berger, two Jewish female parliamentarians. And in the history of that website, of Stormfront, there'd been 14% more mentions of female Jewish MPs than male Jewish MPs, right? And there is something about women in power which triggers this anti-Semitic misogyny. Jewish women in power in particular, it triggers them. So we know there's something here, and of course, we know that female politicians are attacked, get abuse, far more abuse online than the male politicians get. Now, in terms of the impact, it's not just the psychological impact, but obviously that can prevent people from entering public life, which is a disaster because people are marginalized, disadvantaged, and ultimately we're talking about an impact on democracy. Now, here you can see some examples of the language that was being used on Twitter in that time frame, 2017, I think this was, conspiratorial language. The following year, the kind of language that we were seeing around anti-Semitism on Twitter was more hateful language. And that is where I think we end up with this kind of track, is that it's impossible to know how seriously a conspiracy theorist is when they're going to take their beliefs and act. But we know from the Pittsburgh shooting, we know that, you know, these Christchurch, right? The killer killed 51 in New Zealand in 2019. The manifesto included the Great Replacement theory, and people who were commenting on that on 8chan, on another forum, were saying the end game of Globo Homo is to make everyone a weak, mongrelized, degenerate, passive, and aggressive tranny cook worshipping the Jew, right? So you have misogynistic anti-Semitism. These impacts are real world, right? These discourses that happen online leak off into real world impact. And that is part of my major worry about all of this, is the extent to which, because we've seen it with incels, we've seen it in the manosphere, that people will go out and seek to kill, murder people, and particularly women. And we know that it happens with anti-Semitism. And so where you've got this toxic mix, my worry is that it will happen with both.